Please bury my brother, the girl whispers, clutching a limp baby as July heat turns the park air to ash. Then Michelle feels it, a thread-thin pulse that flips a funeral into a countdown and thrusts her into a war she can't walk away from, not after grief already hollowed her life once. A nurse will accuse her of playing savior, a judge will question her right to love, and the city will watch as a millionaire widow chooses a promise at 3 a.m. over her reputation. But when the ICU blares code blue and a tiny heart falters, who gets to decide who stays and who saves whom? Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Michelle Williams had always been the kind of woman who commanded respect without demanding it. At 37, she was Atlanta's quiet philanthropic force, a former family law attorney turned foundation president whose signature graced checks that transformed lives she would never personally meet. In the marble corridors of charitable galas and the hushed conference rooms where millions were allocated to worthy causes, she was known as poised, generous, and unshakably composed. But beneath the designer dresses and the practiced smile lived a woman who had forgotten how to feel anything at all. 2 years had passed since David collapsed in their Buckhead kitchen, his heart giving out before the paramedics could arrive, before Michelle could tell him one last time that he was her entire world. In the aftermath, she had done what people like her were trained to do. She had converted grief into productivity. She woke at 5:30 each morning, answered emails before her first coffee, filled her calendar with board meetings and fundraising events until there was no space left for silence, for memory, for the crushing weight of a king-sized bed where only one side ever wrinkled anymore. For Michelle, living had become an elaborate performance of competence, each day a series of tasks to complete, obligations to fulfill, anything to avoid the terrifying emptiness that waited in the quiet moments between. On that sweltering July afternoon, the Atlanta sun hung heavy and merciless over Piedmont Park, turning the air into something thick enough to taste. Michelle walked slowly along the oak-lined pathways, her heels clicking against the pavement despite the heat that made such formality seem almost absurd. She had just left a foundation meeting at the nearby conference center where she'd committed $2 million to youth homelessness programs, a number that should have felt significant, but instead sat in her chest like just another transaction, cold and distant as all the rest. Around her, the park pulsed with life. Joggers with earbuds and determined expressions, young mothers pushing expensive strollers while sipping iced lattes, professionals on lunch breaks sprawled on picnic blankets with takeout containers balanced on their knees. The world moved and breathed and laughed, and Michelle walked through it like a ghost, present but not participating, seeing without really absorbing, existing in a space between the living and something far more hollow. That's when she heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been distinguishable in the cacophony of urban park noise, yet somehow cut through everything else like a knife through silk. It wasn't the delighted squeals of children on the playground or the rhythmic panting of runners passing by. It was crying, but not the ordinary kind. This was raw, guttural sobbing that seemed to carry the weight of something ancient and unbearable, as if childhood itself was being crushed under burdens far too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Michelle stopped mid-step, her body responding before her mind could process why, one hand instinctively rising to her chest as if to protect her heart from whatever had produced such a sound. She thought about continuing her walk, about pretending she hadn't heard, about maintaining the emotional distance that had kept her functional for 2 years. God knew Atlanta was full of heartbreak, full of people who needed help, full of stories too painful to absorb if you wanted to make it through your own day intact. But something in that cry reached past every defense she'd carefully constructed, past the numbness and the practiced indifference, and touched something she'd thought had died with David. It was the sound of someone who had run out of options, who had exhausted every ounce of strength, and was now simply breaking apart. And Michelle, despite every instinct screaming at her to protect herself from more pain, couldn't walk away. Following the sound with steps that felt both reluctant and inevitable, she left the main pathway and moved toward a more secluded area of the park, where ancient oak trees created patches of shade and the manicured grass gave way to harder-packed earth. There, partially hidden behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes that the parks department had clearly been neglecting, she saw her, a little black girl, no more than 10 years old, sitting on the bare ground with her back against a tree trunk. The child's hair was matted with dirt and twigs, pulled back in what had once been braids, but had long since unraveled into tangled knots. Her clothes, a faded pink t-shirt several sizes too large and shorts held up with a piece of twine, were stained with grime and sweat, and her bare feet were covered in cuts and calluses that spoke of weeks, maybe months, of walking on surfaces that should never touch a child's skin. But it wasn't the girl's appearance that made Michelle's breath catch in her throat and her legs suddenly feel incapable of supporting her weight. It was what the child held in her thin, trembling arms. A baby, perhaps a year old, lying completely still against her chest. The baby's brown skin had taken on an ashen quality. His little lips were dry and slightly parted, and his small body hung limp in a way that made Michelle's stomach turn with recognition. She had seen that stillness before, in the hospital room where David took his last breath, in the terrible moments before she understood he was truly gone. The girl's eyes lifted to meet Michelle's, and in that gaze was something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A mixture of desperate hope and resigned despair. The look of someone who has asked for help so many times that she no longer expects an answer, but can't quite stop trying. And then, with a voice that shook but carried a terrible dignity, the child spoke words that would shatter the careful walls Michelle had built around her heart. "Please, ma'am," the girl whispered, clutching the baby tighter. "Can you help me bury my brother? He didn't wake up this morning, and he's so cold now. I don't have any money for a funeral, but I promise, I swear to God, I'll work and pay you back when I grow up. I can't leave him like he's garbage. He's not garbage. He's John. He's my baby brother." Time seemed to fracture and stop. Michelle felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs, as if the ground beneath her expensive shoes had suddenly become unstable, as if every ounce of blood in her body had turned to ice despite the oppressive July heat. The girl's words pierced through every layer of professional composure and emotional armor she'd spent 2 years constructing, drilling straight into the wound she'd tried so desperately to seal. This child, this little girl who should have been worried about homework and playground politics, was asking a stranger to help her bury the person she loved most in the world, making promises about repayment with a heartbreaking formality that spoke of someone far too familiar with adult negotiations and debt. Michelle's mind raced chaotically. She looked around, searching frantically for any sign of an adult, a parent, a guardian, someone who was supposed to be responsible for these children, someone who could explain what was happening and take this burden from her shoulders. But the secluded area was empty save for the 3 of them, and the sounds of the busy park seemed suddenly distant, as if she and this child and the still baby existed in a separate world entirely. The silence between them was broken only by the girl's ragged breathing and the occasional sob she tried to muffle, as if even in this moment of ultimate desperation, she was trying not to be too much trouble. Michelle couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely, her mind unable to form words adequate to the moment. What could she possibly say? What response existed for such a cruel, innocent, devastating request? She stood frozen, her designer purse hanging uselessly from her shoulder, her foundation meeting notes still clutched in one hand, all the trappings of her carefully ordered life suddenly revealed as absurdly inadequate in the face of this child's grief. And then, as if her body decided what her mind couldn't, Michelle felt her knees bending, felt herself kneeling on the hard ground in her expensive linen pants without caring about the dirt, moving toward the girl and the baby with a compulsion she couldn't name or resist. She understood in that crystallizing moment that she had reached a crossroads she couldn't walk away from, that the time had come when she could no longer hide behind charitable donations and carefully maintain distance. This child's plea demanded not a check or a referral to the appropriate social services. It demanded a response from the broken places inside Michelle that she'd been running from since David died. "May I?" Michelle asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she gestured toward the baby. The girl hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, her arms tightening protectively around her brother, her eyes searching Michelle's face for something. Trustworthiness, perhaps, or simply the desperate hope that this stranger wouldn't disappear like all the others who had surely passed them by. Finally, with heartbreaking reluctance, she nodded. Michelle's hands shook as she reached out, as gently as she had ever touched anything in her life, and placed her fingers on the baby's neck, searching for the one sign that could transform this tragedy into something with even the smallest sliver of hope. The skin beneath her fingertips was cold, so cold it made her chest constrict with recognition, and the tiny body felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate, limp and unresponsive in a way that seemed to confirm everything the girl feared. For long seconds that stretched into what felt like an eternity, Michelle felt nothing but that terrible coldness, and her heart sank with the weight of having to tell this child that her worst nightmare was real. But then, barely there, so faint she thought at first she must be imagining it because the alternative was too cruel, she felt it. A pulse, thread-thin, irregular, barely clinging to life, but unmistakably, miraculously present. When a child asks a stranger to help bury a baby, and a faint pulse turns despair into a race, what instinct should win? Protect the heart or risk it all to stay? Drop a comment right now. Would stepping into that ambulance be mercy or a mistake, and why? "He's alive," Michelle whispered, and her voice cracked on the words as if they were too precious to speak aloud. "Oh my God, sweetheart, he's alive. We need to get him to a hospital right now." She didn't wait for Emma to respond, didn't pause to consider the logistics or the complications or what she was getting herself into. Michelle pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911, and while she waited for the operator to answer, she scooped John's tiny body into her arms as gently as she'd ever held anything in her life. Emma scrambled to her feet beside her, clutching that torn backpack like it held everything she owned, which Michelle would later realize it did. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of sirens and questions and Emma's terrified grip on Michelle's hand. The paramedics arrived with efficient urgency, asking rapid-fire questions that Michelle couldn't answer because she didn't know this child's medical history, didn't know his last name, didn't know anything except that he was dying and they were running out of time. Emma tried to answer through her tears, but her voice kept breaking, and Michelle found herself making a decision without consciously deciding anything at all. She climbed into the ambulance behind the stretcher, pulling Emma in with her, and nobody stopped them. By the time they screeched to a halt at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta's emergency entrance, Michelle's expensive linen pants were stained with dirt from the park and probably worse things she didn't want to think about, and Emma's small hand had gone rigid in hers with fear. The ambulance doors flew open, and suddenly they were surrounded by a swarm of medical personnel in scrubs, all moving with choreographed urgency as they transferred John to a gurney and began shouting things Michelle's brain couldn't quite process fast enough to understand. Severe malnutrition, approximately 12 months old, unresponsive. Core temp is 95.2, possible hypothermia. Get me a line in, we need fluids now. Respiratory distress, likely pneumonia, prep for oxygen support. Emma screamed. It was a sound that came from somewhere so deep and primal that Michelle felt it in her own chest like a physical blow. And suddenly the little girl was lunging forward, trying to grab John's hand before they wheeled him away. "Johnny." "No, wait, I need to stay with him. He needs me." "Johnny." Michelle caught her around the waist, pulling her back even as Emma fought with surprising strength, her small body thrashing against Michelle's hold. "Sweetheart, they need to help him," Michelle said into her ear, her own voice shaking. "They need to take him to get him the medicine he needs. I know it's scary, but they're going to help him." But Emma wasn't hearing her, or couldn't hear her over her own panic, and she kept screaming her brother's name as the double doors swung closed behind the medical team, cutting them off from the only person in the world she had left. Michelle held her tight, feeling the girl's heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribs, and for a moment she was somewhere else entirely. Standing in a different hospital hallway 2 years ago, watching different doors close on someone she loved, feeling the same helpless terror of being shut out from the one place she needed to be. "I've got you," Michelle heard herself saying, over and over like a prayer. "I've got you. You're not alone. I'm right here." Slowly, incrementally, Emma's struggling began to subside, though whether from exhaustion or resignation, Michelle couldn't tell. A nurse, young, with kind eyes and rainbow-patterned scrubs, approached them carefully and gestured toward a waiting area around the corner. "They're going to be working on him for a while," she said gently. "You both should sit down. Can I get you anything? Water?" Michelle nodded numbly and let herself be guided to a cluster of plastic chairs in a waiting room that smelled like industrial cleaner and fear. Emma collapsed into the seat beside her, suddenly boneless, all the fight drained out of her in an instant. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible, and Michelle saw for the first time just how thin she was, how her shoulder blades jutted against the threadbare fabric of her shirt like broken wings. They sat in silence for a long time, surrounded by the sounds of a busy emergency department. Phones ringing, monitors beeping, fragments of conversations floating past. Michelle found herself noticing details she wouldn't have registered in any other state of mind. The way Emma's hands were calloused and cracked like an adult's who worked with them all day. The dirt so deeply embedded under her fingernails that it had become part of them. The way she flinched every single time hospital staff walked past, as if expecting them to reach out and grab her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Michelle asked finally, her voice soft. It occurred to her with a jolt of shame that she'd been calling this child sweetheart, because she hadn't thought to ask the most basic question of all. The girl looked at her for a long moment, assessing, deciding whether to trust this stranger who'd appeared in the park and turned her world upside down. "Emma," she said finally, so quietly Michelle almost didn't hear it. "My name is Emma, and my brother is John. He's 1 year old. Well, 13 months. He had a birthday, but we couldn't." Her voice trailed off, and Michelle felt something crack open in her chest. "Emma," she repeated, tasting the name. "That's a beautiful name." Emma didn't respond to that, just kept staring at the closed doors where they'd taken John, her expression so old and tired that it looked wrong on a 10-year-old face. Michelle wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but before she could find the words, someone else approached them. The woman was in her mid-40s, black, with the kind of authoritative presence that came from years of dealing with crisis situations. Her hospital badge identified her as Patricia Jenkins, RN, and she carried a clipboard with practiced efficiency. "Excuse me," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I need to get some information about the patient. Are you the child's guardian?" Michelle started, then stopped, because what was she? A stranger who'd stumbled across them an hour ago? Someone who'd made a split-second decision that was already spiraling into complications she hadn't anticipated? "No. I found them in Piedmont Park. The baby, John, he wasn't breathing well, and I called 911. Patricia's eyes moved from Michelle to Emma and back again, and something shifted in her expression that Michelle couldn't quite read. "And you are?" "Michelle Williams." She pulled out her driver's license from her purse, hands still trembling slightly. Patricia glanced at the license, and her eyebrows rose just a fraction. "Mrs. Williams," she said, and there was something in her tone now that Michelle definitely didn't like. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" It wasn't really a question. Michelle looked at Emma, who had gone rigid again, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Michelle told her, hoping she was telling the truth. "I'll be right back. I promise." Patricia led her around a corner, out of Emma's line of sight, and turned to face her with arms crossed. "Mrs. Williams, I recognize you from the foundation galas," she said without preamble. "I have to ask, what exactly are your intentions here?" Michelle blinked, confused by the question. "To help. The baby was dying. What do you mean? I mean, Patricia said, and her voice had taken on an edge that was almost confrontational. I've been a nurse for 23 years, and I've seen this before. Wealthy white women playing savior to black children, treating them like charity projects. These kids become the feel-good story you tell at your next gala, and then when the reality gets messy and complicated, you disappear. These children don't need a savior, Mrs. Williams. They need someone who actually sees them for who they are, not just what they represent to ease your conscience. The words hit Michelle like a slap, all the more shocking because she hadn't seen them coming. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, but found she couldn't because Patricia wasn't entirely wrong. Had she considered the racial dynamics of what she was doing? Had she thought past the immediate crisis to what it meant for a white woman to insert herself into these black children's lives? Had she seen Emma and John as whole, complete people, or had they been, on some level she didn't want to examine, a project, a problem to solve? Michelle swallowed hard. I don't know. I just knew I couldn't walk away. The honesty seemed to catch Patricia off guard. Her expression softened slightly, though the wariness didn't entirely leave her eyes. At least you're honest, she said after a moment. But Mrs. Williams, if you're serious about helping these kids, if you're really in this, you need to understand something. You're not pulling them into your world. You're entering theirs. And that's a lot more complicated than writing a check. Michelle nodded, throat tight, because she was starting to understand that this decision she'd made in the park without thinking was going to require a lot more thought than she'd given it. What do I need to do? She asked. Right now? Go sit with that little girl. She's terrified, and you're the only familiar face she has at the moment. Patricia's voice had lost some of its confrontational edge. We'll deal with the rest later. Michelle returned to the waiting room to find Emma exactly where she'd left her, curled into herself in the plastic chair. When Emma looked up and saw her, relief flooded her face so completely that Michelle felt tears prick at her eyes. She sat down, and after a moment of hesitation, Emma leaned slightly toward her, not quite touching but close enough that Michelle could feel her warmth. You came back, Emma whispered. Of course I came back, Michelle said, and wondered how many adults in this child's life had failed to do that simple thing. Hours crawled by. The waiting room emptied and filled and emptied again. Michelle bought food from the cafeteria, a sandwich she couldn't taste and chips she couldn't swallow, and noticed that Emma was staring at it with an intensity that made Michelle's heart hurt. When did you last eat? She asked gently. Emma didn't answer at first, then finally admitted, day before yesterday. There was this lady at the gas station who gave me half her sandwich. 2 days. Michelle's voice came out sharper than she intended. Emma, you haven't eaten in 2 days? Johnny needed the formula more, Emma said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Babies need to eat every day. I can go longer. Michelle pushed the food toward her. Eat, she said, and her voice broke on the word. Please, sweetheart. Eat. Emma ate like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be full, and as she did, she began to talk in fragments, pieces of a story that came out disordered and incomplete, but painted a picture more devastating than Michelle could have imagined. She learned about Grandma Rose, who'd worked as a hospital housekeeper and raised Emma and John alone after their mother disappeared when John was born. She learned that Rose had died 3 months ago, and Emma had found her body in their tiny southwest Atlanta apartment, and rather than call anyone, Emma had hidden the death because she was terrified they'd be separated. They split up brothers and sisters all the time, Emma said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that meant she'd heard this terrible truth repeated enough times to accept it. Grandma told me if anything happened to her, I had to keep us together no matter what. So I did. You've been alone for 3 months. Michelle asked, and she couldn't keep the horror out of her voice. Taking care of John by yourself? At 10 years old. I'm almost 11, Emma corrected, as if those months made all the difference. And I wasn't alone. I had John. Michelle couldn't speak. She reached out slowly, carefully, and put her hand over Emma's small calloused one, and Emma didn't pull away. It was 3 a.m. when the alarm started blaring from the ICU. Sudden, piercing, the kind of sound that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Emma bolted upright from where she'd been dozing against Michelle's shoulder, eyes wild with panic, and then they heard it. Code Blue, Pediatric ICU, Code Blue. Johnny. Emma was on her feet and running before Michelle could stop her, and Michelle ran after her, both of them racing toward the sound. A nurse tried to intercept them, but Emma was small and fast and desperate, and she made it to the ICU windows before anyone could catch her. Through the glass, they could see the team surrounding a tiny bed, could see doctors performing chest compressions on a body so small that Michelle's mind refused to accept what she was seeing. Emma was screaming her brother's name, over and over, beating on the glass with her fists, and Michelle caught her from behind, wrapping her arms around the girl's shaking body and pulling her close. No, 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 please God, no. Emma was sobbing, the words barely coherent, and Michelle was crying too because she was right back in another hospital watching David's monitors flatline, feeling the same crushing helplessness, the same knowledge that she was about to watch someone die and there wasn't a single thing she could do to stop it. 10 minutes. It felt like hours. Michelle held Emma tight and watched the medical team work with relentless efficiency, watched them shock that tiny body, watched the monitors, watched for any sign of hope. And then, finally, the frantic movement slowed. The doctors stepped back. And on the monitor, Michelle could see it, a heartbeat weak and irregular, but there. A doctor emerged, his scrubs soaked with sweat, his expression grave. "He's stabilized for now," he said without preamble. "But I'm not going to lie to you, the next 48 hours are critical. He's severely malnourished, his lungs are full of fluid, and his little body has been through more than most adults could survive. It could go either way." When accusations of saviorism collide with a promise made at 3 a.m., who gets to define genuine care? The system, the headlines, or the ones clinging to each other behind ICU glass? Comment stay, or step back, and explain what proof of commitment would convince a skeptical judge or nurse in this exact situation. Emma collapsed against Michelle, all the strength finally drained from her small body, and Michelle found herself lowering them both to the floor because her own legs wouldn't hold them anymore. She pulled Emma into her lap like she was much younger than 10, and Emma let her, curling into Michelle's chest while sobs shook through her. "I won't let you face this alone," Michelle whispered into Emma's matted hair, making a promise she had no idea how she'd keep. "I'm here. I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere." And there, on the cold hospital floor at 3 a.m. with a child she'd met that afternoon crying in her arms, Michelle finally felt something she hadn't felt since David died. Like she mattered to someone, like her presence made a difference, like she was genuinely, desperately needed. It hurt more than the numbness had, but it also felt like waking up after a very long sleep. When Emma finally cried herself into exhaustion, Michelle carefully lifted her, surprised by how little she weighed, how easy it was to carry this child who'd been carrying the world, and brought her back to the waiting room. A nurse brought blankets, and Michelle made a nest of sorts in the corner chairs, settling Emma against her shoulder. The girl's breathing evened out almost immediately, one hand clutching Michelle's shirt like a lifeline even in sleep. Michelle stayed awake, stroking Emma's hair with one hand while with the other she pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time before finally typing a message to her attorney. "Mark, I need your help. It's urgent. Call me when you wake up." She had no idea what happened next, no idea how any of this worked, no idea if she was making the right choice or the most foolish one of her life. All she knew was that she'd made a promise to a terrified little girl, and that somewhere in the chaos of this impossible night, she'd found something she'd been missing since David died. A reason to fight for something that mattered more than her own grief. Outside the hospital windows, Atlanta slowly lightened from black to gray as dawn approached, and Michelle held Emma tighter and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore that John would survive to see it. Dawn broke slowly over Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost offensive in their beauty, considering the suffering contained within the hospital walls. Michelle watched the sunrise through the waiting room windows, still holding Emma, who'd finally fallen into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder sometime around 4 in the morning. Michelle hadn't slept at all, despite the nurses suggesting multiple times that she should go home, shower, rest. But she'd made a promise to Emma, and Michelle was discovering that some promises mattered more than comfort. Emma stirred as light filled the room, jerking awake with a gasp of panic, her body going rigid as her mind tried to place where she was. "Johnny," she started, voice raw from crying. "He's still stable," Michelle said quickly, tightening her arm around the girl. "The nurse checked 20 minutes ago. He made it through the night, sweetheart." Emma relaxed slightly but didn't pull away, and Michelle took that as progress. After a moment, Emma reached for her torn backpack, the only possession she'd carried into the hospital, and unzipped it with careful hands. She pulled out something wrapped in what looked like an old grocery bag, and when she unwrapped it, Michelle saw it was a photograph, creased and faded, but clearly treasured. "This is Grandma Rose," Emma said softly, holding it out. "She worked here, in this hospital. She cleaned rooms and said she was helping sick people get better by keeping everything clean and safe." Michelle took the photograph carefully, as if it were made of glass, and studied the image. An elderly black woman smiled back at her, wearing a housekeeping uniform, her expression warm and kind despite the exhaustion visible around her eyes. But it was the hospital ID badge clipped to her uniform that made Michelle's breath catch, partially visible but clear enough to read. "Rose Bennett, Environmental Services, 2019. Something about the photo felt familiar in a way Michelle couldn't immediately place, like a word on the tip of her tongue. The background, the lighting, the specific corridor visible behind Rose, Michelle had seen it before. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and scrolled back through her photos, back 2 years to the days she wished she could forget, but couldn't stop remembering. David's final week. His hospital room. Michelle crying beside his bed while nurses moved quietly in the background. She zoomed in on one photo, focusing on the background details she'd never paid attention to before, and there she was, a housekeeper, badge visible, face turned partially toward the camera. The same badge. The same woman. "Emma." Michelle's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother. She cleaned my husband's room when he was dying here. 2 years ago." Emma looked up sharply, her eyes widening. "What?" "I remember her," Michelle continued, the memory flooding back with sudden clarity. "The day before David died, she came into his room with fresh flowers from the hospital chapel. She said," Michelle's throat tightened. "She said flowers bring comfort, even when words can't. She put them where David could see them. Grandma always brought flowers to patients," Emma said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "She said everyone deserves something beautiful to look at, especially when they're scared." They sat in silence for a moment, both absorbing the impossibility of this connection. Of all the people Michelle could have found in that park, of all the children in Atlanta who needed help, she'd found the grandchildren of the woman who'd shown kindness to her dying husband. "Grandma used to say God puts people in each other's paths for a reason," Emma said finally. "She said sometimes you meet someone and you think it's an accident, but it never really is." Michelle couldn't speak. She just pulled Emma closer and stared at the photograph of Rose Bennett, feeling like the universe had orchestrated something she was only beginning to understand. The moment shattered when a woman with a clipboard appeared in the waiting room doorway, her expression professionally sympathetic but firm. "Mrs. Williams? I'm Karen Martinez, hospital social worker. We need to talk." Emma went rigid again, and Michelle felt the girl's hand grip hers tightly. Karen sat down across from them and launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed speech about protocols and procedures, about how Child Protective Services had been notified as required for any unaccompanied minor in a life-threatening situation, about how Emma's background check had revealed no legal guardian and a deceased grandmother. "Once John is stabilized enough for discharge, Emma will need to be placed in emergency foster care," Karen concluded, her tone suggesting this was simply the way things worked. No. Emma's voice cracked with panic. You promised. Miss Michelle, you said we'd stay together. I understand this is difficult, Karen began, but Michelle cut her off. What if I take custody? The words came out before Michelle had fully thought them through, but once spoken, she didn't want to take them back. Karen blinked, clearly surprised. Mrs. Williams, temporary custody requires background checks, home studies, court approval. It's not a simple process. I'm aware, Michelle said, and felt something like her old attorney self emerging. I was a family law attorney before my husband died. Start the paperwork. Karen hesitated, and in that pause, Michelle heard everything she wasn't saying. The court will scrutinize this carefully, Karen said finally, especially given the circumstances. Given what? Michelle's voice hardened. That I'm white and Emma and John are black? I understand the optics, but what matters is that these children need someone who won't abandon them. Mrs. Williams, the system exists to protect children from well-meaning people who aren't prepared for the reality, Karen said, not unkindly. Intentions aren't enough. Then let the system assess me, Michelle replied. But I'm not walking away. Emma's grip on her hand tightened, becoming almost painful, and Michelle squeezed back. Before Karen could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. Patricia Jenkins, the nurse who'd challenged Michelle the day before. Karen, can I borrow Mrs. Williams for a minute? It wasn't really a question. Michelle followed Patricia to a quiet corner, bracing for another confrontation, but Patricia's expression was thoughtful rather than confrontational. You're serious about this, she said. I've never been more serious about anything, Michelle replied. Patricia studied her for a long moment. Rose Bennett was my friend. We worked together for 15 years. She talked about her grandkids constantly, showed me pictures of baby John, worried about how she'd manage after her daughter left. She paused. She died alone in that apartment. Emma found her. Can you imagine what that child has been carrying? Michelle shook her head, throat too tight to speak. Rose would want her babies protected, Patricia continued. If you're doing this, you need to do it right. I'll testify on your behalf, but you have to prove you're in this for the long haul. Because it will get hard, Mrs. Williams. Harder than you can imagine. How do I prove that? Michelle asked. By not giving up when everyone questions you. By not giving up when it hurts. By showing up every single day, even when it would be easier to walk away. Patricia's expression softened slightly. If you can do that, you might actually be what these kids need. Before Michelle could respond, a doctor emerged from the ICU, and both women turned toward him. We're seeing improvement, he said, cautiously optimistic. John opened his eyes briefly and responded to stimuli. He's fighting. The next week is critical, but he's definitely fighting. Emma was allowed to visit, suited up in protective gear that swallowed her small frame. Michelle watched through the glass as Emma approached John's incubator and touched his tiny hand. It's okay, Johnny, Emma whispered. I'm here. She's here too. We're safe now. Michelle felt tears streaming down her face because Emma had said we're safe, and that meant Emma believed in her, trusted her, and that trust felt like both a gift and a responsibility heavier than anything Michelle had ever carried. She thought of David in his final days, of how helpless she'd felt watching him slip away. But she also remembered his last coherent words to her. Don't let grief make you invisible. Promise me you'll keep living. Michelle had broken that promise every day since he died, but looking at Emma and John now, she understood. This was how she kept it. This was how she became visible again. Michelle stepped away and called her attorney. Mark, she said when he answered, I need your help. I'm filing for emergency custody of 2 children, and I need the best family law team you can assemble. Money is no object. There was a pause on the other end. Michelle, are you sure about this? She looked at Emma through the glass, watching the girl sing softly to her baby brother. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. If love is cross-examined and a tiny heartbeat keeps fighting, is showing up every day enough to become family? Or does intent crumble without cultural accountability and cost? Share a final verdict below. Should emergency custody go through? Under what conditions? And what promise must never be broken for Emma and John to truly be safe? 2 weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness, each day bringing small victories and new complications. John improved gradually, his tiny body proving more resilient than anyone had dared hope, though he remained hospitalized under careful monitoring. Meanwhile, Michelle's life transformed into a whirlwind of paperwork and scrutiny as the custody process moved forward. Her home study was completed, the Buckhead mansion deemed more than adequate for 2 children, and her background check came back spotless, her financial stability so unquestionable it was almost absurd to verify. But opposition mounted from corners Michelle hadn't anticipated. Families First Atlanta, a community advocacy group, filed a formal objection arguing that transracial adoption without a comprehensive cultural competency plan would harm the children. Then the local news picked up the story, and suddenly Michelle's private decision became public spectacle. The headline read, "Millionaire Widow Seeks Custody of Homeless Black Children," and the comment section exploded with opinions from people who knew nothing about her, about Emma, about the promise she'd made in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning. "White savior complex," one comment read. "Those children need their own community, not some rich lady's guilt project," said another. "Money doesn't equal good parenting. This woman thinks she can buy anything." Michelle read them late at night when she couldn't sleep, each accusation planting seeds of doubt that grew in the dark. Was she doing the right thing? Was she really prepared for this? Could she give Emma and John what they needed, or was she just using them to fill the hole David's death had left? Emma found her one evening, staring at her laptop screen with tears streaming down her face. The girl had been staying in Michelle's guest room during John's hospitalization, a temporary arrangement that felt increasingly permanent. "Are you going to change your mind?" Emma asked, her voice small and careful. "Everyone thinks you should." Michelle looked at this child who'd survived 3 months alone on Atlanta's streets, who'd kept her baby brother alive through sheer will and fierce love, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. "Everyone isn't raising you," she said firmly. "We are. Together." Emma smiled for the first time in weeks, and Michelle knew that no matter what happened in court, she'd already made the only choice she could live with. The courtroom was smaller than Michelle remembered from her days practicing law, and somehow that made it feel more intimate, more intense. Judge Margaret Edward presided from the bench, her expression inscrutable, her reputation for being tough but fair preceding her. Assistant District Attorney James Morrison represented the state's interests, while Michelle's attorney Mark Sullivan sat beside her, exuding confidence she wished she could borrow. Emma sat on Michelle's other side, wearing new clothes Michelle had bought, simple but nice, and clutching Michelle's hand so tightly the circulation was probably cut off. John remained hospitalized, but a guardian ad litem had been appointed to represent his interests in the proceedings. Morrison's opening argument was powerful and measured. "Your Honor, Mrs. Williams' actions were commendable. She saved this child's life, and for that we're grateful. But heroism doesn't equal qualification for parenthood. There are 300 families in Georgia's adoption registry, many of them black families who could provide the cultural connection and community these children need. Mrs. Williams, despite her considerable resources, cannot give these children what they truly need, a reflection of themselves in the people raising them." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and Michelle felt her stomach drop because he wasn't wrong about the importance of cultural identity, and she knew it. Judge Edward turned her penetrating gaze on Michelle. "Mrs. Williams, why should I grant you custody over families who've waited years for this opportunity?" Michelle stood on trembling legs, acutely aware of every eye in the room watching her. "Your Honor, I can't give Emma and John a perfect life. I can't undo what they've experienced, and I can't fully understand what they'll face because of the color of their skin. I'm aware of my limitations." Morrison seized the opening. "Then why pursue this at all, Mrs. Williams?" She turned to face him and found her voice growing steadier. "Because Emma asked me not to leave. Because when I found them in that park, I saw myself, someone trying to survive unbearable loss. My husband died 2 years ago, and I've been existing but not living. These children reminded me what it means to fight for something that matters. Your Honor, Morrison said, his tone almost gentle. This is exactly the problem. Mrs. Williams is using these children to heal her own grief. Michelle's carefully maintained composure shattered. You're right, she said, and the courtroom stirred with surprise. You're right that I'm white and privileged and will never fully understand what Emma and John will face. You're right that there are families who've waited longer and might offer cultural connections I can't provide. You're right that I'm still grieving my husband. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. But you're wrong about one thing. When I found Emma holding John, believing he was dead, I didn't see a white woman helping black children. I saw a little girl loving her brother so fiercely that she was willing to dig his grave with her own hands rather than abandon him to a system she didn't trust. Michelle turned to Emma, whose eyes were brimming with tears. That kind of love doesn't need saving, it needs honoring. I'm not here to save Emma. She's already saved herself and John 100 times over. I'm here to learn from her what real courage looks like. And if she'll let me, I want to stand beside her while she continues saving her brother. She faced the judge again, voice breaking but determined. My husband made me promise before he died that I wouldn't let grief make me invisible. For 2 years, I broke that promise. But Emma and John made me visible again, made me matter again. If you rule against me today, I'll accept it, but I'll never stop fighting for them. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Morrison looked uncertain, and Michelle could see Patricia Jenkins in the gallery, nodding with what looked like approval. Judge Edward addressed Emma directly. Young lady, I'd like to hear from you. What do you want? Emma stood, small but steady. I want someone who won't leave. What makes you think Mrs. Williams won't leave? The judge asked. Because she already stayed, Emma said simply. When Johnny's heart stopped, she stayed. When people said mean things online, she stayed. My grandma told me the best people are the ones who stay when it's hard. I promised Grandma I'd keep Johnny safe. Miss Michelle promised me she'd help. She hasn't broken her promise yet. The devastating simplicity of Emma's words hung in the air. Michelle saw several people in the gallery wiping their eyes, and even Morrison looked affected. The judge called a recess to deliberate, and the 30-minute wait felt eternal. Michelle held Emma's hand, both of them terrified, both of them hoping. When Judge Edward returned, her expression gave nothing away. I've considered all arguments carefully, she began. This court recognizes the importance of cultural identity and community connection. However, this court also recognizes that love and commitment transcend race when genuine. Mrs. Williams, I'm granting temporary custody for 6 months with conditions. Mandatory cultural competency training, regular check-ins with Patricia Jenkins as family advocate, and therapy for all parties. Emma, John, you're going home with Mrs. Williams. The courtroom erupted, but Michelle heard none of it because Emma had collapsed into her arms, sobbing with relief. I've got you, Michelle whispered, holding her tight. I've got you both. Patricia approached, hand extended. Welcome to the hardest job you'll ever love. As they exited the courthouse into a barrage of camera flashes, Michelle felt the weight of what she'd taken on, but also felt something else, purpose, hope, and the beginning of healing she hadn't known was possible. Emma held her hand tightly, and together they stepped into their new life. 3 weeks after the courtroom decision, Michelle stood outside Children's Healthcare of Atlanta once more, but this time everything felt different. Emma sat beside her in the car, fidgeting with nervous energy, her eyes fixed on the hospital entrance. What if he doesn't remember me? She asked for the 3rd time that morning, her voice small and uncertain. Michelle reached over and squeezed her hand gently. He's your brother, sweetheart. He'll always know you. The court-ordered transition period had been necessary. Time for paperwork, for home preparations, for everyone to adjust to the new reality. But it had been torture for Emma, who'd barely been separated from John since the day they arrived at the hospital. Now, finally, they were bringing him home. Inside, They found John's hospital room transformed into a celebration. The nursing staff had dressed him in donated clothes that actually fit his now healthy frame, and the weight gain was visible and miraculous. When Emma walked through the door, John's entire face lit up with recognition, and he reached for her immediately with chubby arms, making sounds of pure joy. Emma burst into tears and rushed to him, scooping him up carefully while he grabbed fistfuls of her hair and babbled happily against her shoulder. "The bond is unbroken," Patricia said softly from the doorway, where she'd come to oversee the discharge. "He's still on antibiotics, and we have follow-up appointments scheduled, but Michelle, he's thriving. You should be proud of what you've done here." The goodbyes with the medical staff were emotional. Nurses who'd spent weeks caring for John hugged Emma and Michelle both, many with tears in their eyes. They'd become invested in this story, these lives, and letting John go felt like sending off one of their own. Michelle signed the final discharge papers with hands that trembled slightly, and the reality hit her fully. She was now responsible for 2 lives, 2 children who depended on her completely. A brief moment of panic must have shown on her face because Patricia appeared at her elbow. "Breathe," she said quietly. "You're not alone in this, Michelle. You've got support. You've got me." Loading John into the car seat, Michelle had spent hours researching, reading safety ratings and reviews until her eyes crossed. Took longer than expected because Emma insisted on doing it herself, on making sure every strap was perfect. She climbed into the back seat beside him, refusing Michelle's gentle suggestion that she might want to sit up front. "I need to be near him," Emma said simply, and Michelle understood. As they drove through Atlanta toward Buckhead, Emma sang softly to John, an old song their grandmother had taught her, something about angels watching over babies. Michelle watched them in the rearview mirror and felt tears of joy streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. The gate to the estate opened slowly, and Emma's eyes widened as the mansion came into view. "This is where we're staying?" she asked, sounding overwhelmed. "This is home now," Michelle said, parking the car. Inside the marble foyer, Emma froze, still clutching John tightly, her eyes scanning the space with old survival instincts Michelle recognized, looking for exits, for threats, for reasons not to trust this seemingly perfect situation. Michelle knelt to her level and spoke gently. "I know this doesn't feel like home yet. It hasn't felt like home to me since David died. But maybe we can figure out together what home is supposed to feel like." Emma's voice came out small and scared. "What if we're not enough to make you happy?" The question hit Michelle like a physical blow, revealing the fear this child had been carrying, that somehow her worth was tied to Michelle's happiness, that she could fail at being lovable enough. "Oh, sweetheart," Michelle said, eyes filling with tears. "I'm not looking for you to make me happy. I'm looking for us to learn how to be a family, messy and imperfect and real." Emma's rigid posture finally softened, and she allowed herself to lean into Michelle's embrace. John nestled between them like the glue holding them together. The tour of the house was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Michelle had spent the past weeks preparing Emma's room with soft colors and age-appropriate toys, consulting a child psychologist about what a 10-year-old girl who'd lived on the streets might need to feel safe. John's nursery was next door, connected by a door Michelle had insisted be left open. "All this is really ours?" Emma kept asking, touching things tentatively as if they might disappear. "All of this is really ours together," Michelle assured her each time. When Emma set John on the floor of his nursery and watched him explore carpet for the first time in his life, she whispered, "He's never had carpet before," and Michelle had to turn away to hide fresh tears. That first night, they tried eating dinner in the formal dining room, but it felt too stiff, too wrong for what they were trying to build. They relocated to the kitchen instead, eating mac and cheese, Emma's favorite, at the counter, making small talk that was stilted but genuine as they all found their rhythm. Bath time became a negotiation when Emma insisted on bathing John herself, but Michelle supervised, and they made it work. At bedtime, Emma refused to sleep in her own room, despite its careful decorations. "What if something happens?" she asked, voice tight with anxiety. "What if he needs me?" Michelle didn't force it. "How about we set up a mattress in John's room for tonight?" she suggested, and Emma's relief was palpable. Michelle read them a bedtime story, and though Emma pretended disinterest, Michelle noticed she listened intently to every word. John fell asleep first, then Emma soon after, one hand resting on his crib even in sleep. Michelle stood in the doorway watching them, and she could almost see David's face in her memory, could almost hear his voice saying, "You're doing it. You're living again." "I'm trying," she whispered back into the darkness. Days turned to weeks, and slowly they established routines. Mornings were chaotic as Emma learned to navigate getting ready for the diverse private school Michelle had chosen specifically for its cultural competency program. John's pediatric appointments became celebrations of his continued health and development. Patricia's weekly visits started tense but gradually became something Michelle looked forward to, especially when Patricia patiently taught her how to do Emma's hair, a humbling and frustrating process that somehow became a bonding experience. Michelle enrolled in African American cultural education courses, determined to do this right, to honor the promise she'd made in court. Emma slowly began to trust, though she still tested boundaries regularly. "Are you going to send us back if I'm bad?" she'd ask, and Michelle would respond firmly, "There's no sending back. This is it. You're stuck with me." Emma's first real laugh in response was worth every difficult moment. 1 month after the custody decision, Emma showed Michelle her grandmother's photograph again. "Grandma used to say God makes families in all kinds of ways," she said softly. "She was right," Michelle agreed. "Do you think she knows?" Emma asked. "That we're okay now?" "I think she knows," Michelle said. "I think she and David are both watching, making sure we figure this out." Emma was quiet for a moment, then asked carefully, "Can I call you Michelle?" "Nah, not Mom yet. Maybe someday, but not yet." Michelle's heart both broke and soared at once. "Michelle is perfect," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." They sat together on the couch, John playing with blocks on the floor, and the house that had been a mausoleum for 2 years finally filled with life again. When Michelle's phone buzzed with a message from her foundation assistant asking about upcoming events, she ignored it without hesitation. Some things were more important than money or status, or maintaining her public image. Emma leaned against her shoulder in the first truly voluntary gesture of affection, and Michelle wrapped her arm around her. "We're going to be okay," Emma whispered, maybe convincing herself. "We're going to be better than okay," Michelle promised. "We're going to be family." As sunset cast warm light through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold, Michelle looked at these 2 children who'd come into her life through impossible circumstances and felt grateful in a way she hadn't since David died. John's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent too long. Emma's tentative smile grew more confident each day, and Michelle's tears were finally tears of joy instead of grief. Home, she thought. Finally, truly home. 6 months later, the temporary custody became permanent. Emma thrived in school, making friends and discovering she loved reading. John was walking and babbling, hitting every developmental milestone his doctors had once feared he'd never reach. Michelle was transformed, vibrant, present, purposeful in ways that made her old life seem like a faded photograph of someone else entirely. Patricia had become a close friend, joining them for regular Sunday dinners, where she and Emma would cook traditional soul food recipes Rose had taught Patricia years ago. The community that had doubted Michelle's intentions now celebrated her commitment, and the foundation she ran took on new meaning as she brought Emma to events, teaching her about philanthropy rooted in genuine connection rather than distant charity. One ordinary Tuesday evening, as Michelle tucked Emma into bed, she'd finally, gradually moved into her own room. Emma said 3 words that made time stop. "I love you." Michelle's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, sweetheart," she whispered. "Both of you. Always." As she left Emma's room and checked on John sleeping peacefully in his crib, Michelle thought about the day in Piedmont Park that had changed everything. She'd thought she was saving 2 children, but the truth was more complex and beautiful than that. Sometimes the people we save end up saving us instead. And sometimes the family we choose becomes the family we need. In the quiet of her home, their home, filled with the sound of children's breathing and the promise of tomorrow, Michelle finally understood what David had meant about not letting grief make her invisible. She was visible now. She mattered. She was loved. And she was at last truly alive.
For watching the story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out.